I am Harrison Gallagher, 73 years old, and somehow still standing after my own flesh and blood tried to bury me alive. For 45 years, I worked as a commercial structural engineer in Seattle, building skyscrapers designed to withstand earthquakes, hurricane winds, and the relentless test of time. I thought I had built my family with the exact same unbreakable foundation. I was horribly wrong. Every year, my children told me I ruined Christmas with my old-fashioned rules and constant nagging. Yet every year, they gladly let me pay $150,000 to fund their lavish holiday in Sun Valley. This year, I did not show up. I did not pay for any of it either. When the frantic phone calls started rolling in at exactly 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve, I simply sat by my fireplace, sipped a glass of red wine, and let the silence do the talking. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth and tried to take advantage of your generosity. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in the industrial heart of the city taught me the value of a dollar and the true meaning of hard work. My late wife Caroline and I raised our two children, Bradley and Natalie, in a beautiful, sprawling home on Mercer Island. We gave them absolutely everything we never had growing up. They attended elite private schools, received lessons from expensive tutors, and graduated from top-tier universities completely debt-free. I genuinely believed that by giving them a massive head start in life, I was setting them up for a future of success, integrity, and strong moral character. Instead, I only succeeded in breeding an unimaginable level of entitlement. After Caroline passed away 4 years ago from a sudden and aggressive illness, the warmth in our family vanished completely. The Sunday dinners stopped happening. The casual phone calls checking in on me dwindled to nothing. The only time my children ever sought my company was when a massive bill needed paying, a luxury vacation needed funding, or a down payment for a new luxury car was required. I became an open wallet, a silent and convenient sponsor for their extravagant and reckless lifestyles. It all came to a devastating head on Thanksgiving morning. The cold Seattle rain was beating steadily against the large floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my kitchen. I had woken up early, as I always do, my internal clock permanently set to 5 in the morning. From decades of arriving at freezing construction sites before the sun even thought about rising. I brewed a large pot of dark roast coffee, breathing in the rich aroma and appreciating the quiet, undisturbed solitude of the massive house. Bradley and his wife Monica had stayed over the night before bringing their 2 young children. They were fast asleep upstairs, resting in the comfortable temperature-controlled guest rooms my money maintained. I walked over to the massive marble kitchen island to grab my favorite ceramic mug. That was when I saw it. Monica had carelessly left her tablet sitting on the counter. The screen was facing up, and she had completely forgotten to lock the device. As I reached across the marble surface for my coffee, the screen suddenly lit up with a bright notification. It was an incoming message from a private group chat. The name of the group chat caught my eye immediately and sent a strange chill down my spine. It was titled Operation Freedom John. Curiosity got the better of me. I am not a man who snoops through other people's personal belongings, but something about that specific title sent a cold, urgent warning signal straight to my gut. I leaned closer to the glowing screen. The preview of the text message was clearly visible, glaring up at me in stark black and white text. It was from my own son, Bradley. The exact words were burned into my memory instantly, searing themselves into my brain like hot iron. He wrote, "Let the old man complain through this last Sun Valley trip. The conservatorship papers go into effect the first week of January. Monica already secured a bed at Shady Pines. It is cheap, locked down 24 hours a day, and he will not be able to bother anyone anymore." I stopped breathing entirely. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. I stood frozen in my own kitchen, gripping the edge of the marble counter so hard that my knuckles turned completely white. My mind, trained for decades to analyze catastrophic structural failures and calculate immense stress loads, immediately began to process the horrific information. Conservatorship papers, Shady Pines, Operation Freedom. The terrifying implications were staggering and immediate. They were not just planning to slowly drain my bank accounts or manipulate my assets. They were actively planning to take my freedom, my autonomy, my dignity, and my entire life. They wanted to legally declare me mentally incompetent and lock me away in a cheap, highly secure facility while they freely drained my massive estate. I thought deeply about the upcoming Sun Valley trip. Every single December, I rented a massive, luxurious ski chalet in Idaho for the entire extended family. I paid for the first-class flights, the private gourmet chefs, the expensive ski lift tickets, and the endless bottles of imported champagne. The total bill always hovered right around $150,000. And every single year, Bradley and Natalie would invite their pretentious, wealthy friends, completely ignoring me the entire time. They would roll their eyes with dramatic annoyance when I simply asked them to put their cell phones away during our family dinners. They constantly whispered behind my back that my negativity and strict old-fashioned rules ruined their festive vibe. Yet they never once offered to pay a single dime for their own vacations. Now looking at that glowing screen, I realized this upcoming luxury trip was meant to be my final farewell tour, a grand, final extravagant holiday entirely on my dime before they legally threw me away like a piece of expired garbage. The sudden sound of soft footsteps on the wooden stairs snapped me violently out of my dark thoughts. Someone was coming down to the kitchen. I quickly tapped the power button on the side of the tablet, sending the glowing screen back into absolute blackness. I took a slow, deep, calculated breath, forcing my racing heart rate to steady and my facial muscles to relax. In my many years managing massive construction sites, I had faced catastrophic equipment failures, sudden multi-million-dollar budget collapses, and treacherous, life-threatening weather conditions. I knew exactly how to keep a perfectly level head in the middle of a massive crisis. I calmly picked up my coffee mug and turned around just as Monica walked into the brightly lit kitchen. She was wearing an expensive silk robe that I had personally paid for last Christmas, her hair perfectly styled, even at 7 in the morning. She flashed me a bright, heavily rehearsed smile. It was the exact kind of smile she used when she wanted me to babysit the kids for a long weekend, or when she desperately needed a massive check to cover her endless, unnecessary home renovations. "Good morning, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that made my stomach turn. "You are up incredibly early as usual." She walked casually over to the coffee maker, completely and utterly unaware that I had just uncovered her sinister plot to completely destroy my life. "Good morning, Monica," I replied naturally, keeping my voice perfectly even and entirely calm. Old habits die hard, I am afraid. The quiet mornings are always the absolute best part of the day. She poured herself a steaming cup of coffee and leaned comfortably against the marble counter right next to her locked tablet. "Are you getting excited about the big Sun Valley trip next month?" she asked, blowing softly on her hot drink, with a picture-perfect expression of familial interest. "Bradley and I were just talking last night about how incredibly generous you are to do this for the family every single year. The kids are absolutely thrilled. We really think it is going to be our best Christmas yet." I watched her incredibly closely. I studied the exact way her eyes avoided making direct, sustained contact, with mine darting instead to the rainy window and then quickly back down to her ceramic cup. I noticed the slight nervous tension in her lower jaw, the way her manicured fingers gripped the handle of the mug just a little too tightly. She was a truly terrible actress. I realized right then and there that her entire demeanor was nothing more than a carefully constructed, highly manipulative mask. Every sweet word she spoke, every affectionate gesture she made, was a highly calculated move designed solely to keep me completely complacent while they finalized their devious legal trap behind my back. I am very much looking forward to it. I lied smoothly, offering her a warm, grandfatherly smile that masked the absolute fury burning inside my chest. It is always so nice to have the whole family together under one roof for the holidays, especially since Caroline has been gone. It really means a lot to me to see everyone happy. Monica stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and placed a perfectly manicured hand gently on my arm. "Oh, Harrison," she cooed gently, her voice softening in a brilliant display of practiced hollow sympathy. "We miss her so much, too. But Caroline would be so incredibly happy to see us all maintaining these wonderful family traditions. You are doing such a wonderful job taking care of all of us." I gently patted her resting hand, playing the role of the lonely, grateful, slowly fading widower to absolute perfection. But beneath my calm, welcoming exterior, a cold, highly calculating fury was aggressively taking shape. As soon as Monica turned her back to walk toward the sink and rinse her silver spoon, I watched her subtly wipe the exact spot on her arm, where my hand had just rested, as if she were hastily brushing away contaminated dirt. That tiny subconscious, incredibly cruel movement told me absolutely everything I needed to know about my current reality. They viewed me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. I was not a loving father or a cherished father-in-law to them. I was simply a decaying, temporary obstacle standing between their endless greed and my hard-earned bank accounts. I took another slow sip of my dark coffee, letting the strong, bitter taste wash over my tongue and ground me in the present moment. I did not confront her right then and there. I did not yell, scream, or angrily demand immediate explanations for the text messages I had seen. As a seasoned structural engineer, I knew perfectly well that when you find a massive critical flaw deep within the foundation of a building, you do not start blindly hitting the support walls with a sledgehammer. Doing so only causes reckless, uncontrolled damage. Instead, you carefully study the original blueprints. You locate the exact load-bearing pillars holding the entire corrupt structure together. And then you strategically and silently remove those specific pillars so that the entire massive building inevitably collapses under its own immense weight. Bradley and Monica arrogantly thought they were dealing with a clueless, rapidly deteriorating old man who would simply fade quietly and obediently into the background of a locked-down nursing home. They truly believed I was too weak and oblivious to fight back against their sophisticated legal maneuvering. They had absolutely no idea that they had just aggressively declared war on a man who had spent half a century designing and constructing frameworks that could not be broken by any force of nature. I walked slowly out of the kitchen, Monica one final pleasant smile, and headed straight toward the quiet solitude of my private study. The festive holiday season had officially begun for the rest of the world, but I was not going to be spending my time planning a luxurious winter vacation. I was going to sit at my solid oak desk, pull out my legal pads, and meticulously plan an absolute demolition. The rest of that Thanksgiving day passed in a blur of agonizing domestic theater. I spent the afternoon sitting in my favorite leather armchair in the living room, a book resting open on my lap while I quietly observed the people I had raised. The house slowly filled with the rich, savory aromas of roasting turkey, fresh sage, and melted butter. Natalie and her husband Derek arrived shortly after 2 o'clock, bringing with them a ridiculously expensive bottle of imported wine and an air of unearned superiority. They kissed my cheek, handed me my coat, and immediately began complaining about the heavy Seattle traffic, as if it were a personal insult directed entirely at them. I watched my 2 children and their spouses move through my home, pouring themselves generous glasses of my expensive scotch, laughing loudly at their own shallow jokes, and completely ignoring my presence. It was a bizarre, deeply unsettling experience. I was looking at them through an entirely new lens. Before that morning, I had seen a flawed but ultimately loving family. Now I saw a pack of hungry wolves impatiently circling a wounded animal, just waiting for the exact moment to strike. I remained perfectly composed. I smiled when they spoke to me. I nodded along to their tedious stories about country club politics and minor inconveniences at their high-paying corporate jobs. I was gathering critical data, silently taking inventory of my enemies before launching my counteroffensive. By the time we all finally sat down at the massive mahogany dining table that evening, the sheer hypocrisy in the room was almost physically suffocating. The table was absolutely covered in a lavish spread of gourmet food, crystal glasses, and silver cutlery. Monica had spent the better part of the afternoon ordering expensive catered dishes from a high-end local restaurant, plating them meticulously to look as though she had cooked everything from scratch. Bradley sat directly across from me, carving the large turkey with a practiced, arrogant flourish. Natalie sat to his right, constantly checking her designer smartwatch and texting her friends about the upcoming ski trip I was funding. The conversation flowed easily around me, entirely focused on their own lives, their own desires, and their own future plans. They treated me like a silent piece of expensive furniture. I took a slow bite of my food, chewing methodically, while my mind raced back to a very specific afternoon approximately 1 month prior. It was a rainy Tuesday. Bradley had stopped by the house unannounced, carrying a thick, heavy stack of legal documents and wearing a tight, hurried expression. He had rushed into my study, slapping the papers down on my desk, claiming they were updated trust tax documents required by the state of Washington for the upcoming fiscal year. He had spoken rapidly, throwing around complicated financial jargon, insisting that his accountant needed my signature immediately to avoid massive estate tax penalties. I had trusted my son. I had signed the papers without calling my own legal counsel, assuming he was simply protecting the family assets just as I had taught him. But as I sat there at the Thanksgiving table, connecting the sinister dots from the morning text message, a chilling realization washed over me. Those were not tax documents. I remembered noticing a few strange, heavily worded paragraphs near the back of the stack. They had contained complex medical terminology and clauses regarding healthcare proxies. When I had briefly questioned him about it, he had smoothly brushed it off as standard bureaucratic boilerplate. Now the horrifying truth was coming into sharp, devastating focus. They had tricked me into signing away my own life. I needed to test the structural integrity of their lie. I needed to see exactly how they would react when forced to defend their crumbling foundation. I waited patiently for the perfect moment. The conversation had temporarily lulled as everyone focused on their plates. The only sounds in the grand dining room were the soft clinking of silver forks against fine china and the crackling of the large stone fireplace behind me. I set my fork down gently, picked up my linen napkin, and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I made sure my posture was slightly slouched, projecting the image of a tired, easily confused older man. I looked directly across the table, fixing my gaze firmly on my son. "Bradley," I said, my voice completely calm and perfectly steady. "I was thinking earlier today about those trust tax documents you had me sign last month." Bradley paused midway through lifting his wine glass. His eyes flicked toward me, a sudden flash of irritation crossing his face at the interruption. "Yes, Dad," he replied, keeping his tone light but slightly strained. "What about them? The tax deadline is handled. You do not need to worry about any of that boring administrative stuff." I leaned forward just a fraction of an inch, keeping my expression entirely innocent and mildly curious. While I was just trying to remember the details, I continued, letting my words hang in the quiet room. I recall there being a few pages near the back that did not seem to have anything to do with estate taxes. They had some rather strange, highly specific medical clauses. Something about giving you absolute authority over advanced health care directives and making binding medical decisions on my behalf. What exactly was that about, son? The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely unmistakable. It was as if I had suddenly dropped a live, ticking explosive directly into the center of the roasted turkey. The entire table froze. It was not a subtle pause. It was a complete, horrifying cessation of all movement. Monica stopped chewing her food, her jaw locked tightly in place, her eyes widening in sudden naked panic. Natalie dropped her fork. It hit her porcelain plate with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed violently through the silent dining room. Derek stiffened in his chair, his broad shoulders instantly hiking up toward his ears like a severely frightened animal. But it was Bradley who gave away the absolute most. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. For a fraction of a second, the confident, arrogant son I knew vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified, guilty child caught in a massive, unforgivable lie. He did not look at me. Instead, his eyes darted violently to the left, locking eyes with Monica in a silent, desperate exchange of pure panic. They were utterly terrified. They thought I was questioning the devious legal trap they had so carefully laid behind my back. They thought their master plan was suddenly unraveling right before their very eyes. I sat there perfectly still, watching the sheer terror wash over the people who had planned to throw me away. I did not break eye contact with my son. I let the silence stretch out long and agonizing, making them sweat under the immense pressure of their own guilt. The tension in the room was so incredibly thick, it could have been cut with a heavy steel blade. I had successfully hit a vital nerve. I smiled. The agonizing silence in the dining room hung heavy and thick, stretching out for what felt like an absolute eternity. I carefully watched the sheer naked terror dance behind my son's eyes as his brain frantically worked to process the massive error he thought he had made. Then, like a trained actor stepping back into a well-rehearsed role, Bradley forced a sudden, breathless laugh. It was a hollow, artificial sound that completely failed to reach his eyes, but it was enough to break the paralyzing tension that had violently gripped the entire table. "Oh, those specific pages," Bradley said, waving his hand dismissively in the air, as if he were swatting away an annoying fly. He picked up his crystal wineglass with a hand that was still trembling ever so slightly, taking a long, deep swallow of the expensive vintage before setting it back down on the pristine white tablecloth. "Dad, you really do overthink these administrative things. That is just standard Washington state estate tax law. It is nothing but bureaucratic boilerplate designed to protect your assets from excessive state taxation." I deliberately kept my expression entirely blank, projecting the image of a mildly confused, slightly anxious old man. "Estate tax law," I repeated slowly, letting my voice waver just a fraction to sell the performance. But why would state tax documents require sweeping authorizations for advanced healthcare directives and total medical proxy control? That seems highly unusual for a simple financial filing, does it not? Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table, adopting the patient, overly simplified tone of a kindergarten teacher, addressing a particularly slow child. "It is incredibly common for modern comprehensive trust structures, Dad." He offered a smooth, reassuring smile that made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. "The insurance companies in this state require those specific medical clauses to expedite any potential claims if you ever need routine health checkups covered by the trust. It simply removes the red tape and allows us to handle the boring paperwork so you do not have to stress over complicated legal jargon. It is entirely for your own benefit, I promise." Monica, having finally recovered from her initial shock, immediately jumped in to reinforce her husband's desperate lie. "Exactly, Harrison," she chimed in, her voice returning to that sickeningly sweet artificial pitch. "Bradley spent weeks working closely with the top financial advisors in Seattle just to make sure your estate is perfectly shielded from those terrible government taxes. You should be thanking him for being so incredibly diligent and proactive with your affairs." I nodded slowly, taking a small bite of my roasted turkey, carefully concealing the dark, calculating fury that was raging inside my chest. Their ability to lie so smoothly, to look me directly in the eyes, and twist the truth with such practiced ease was genuinely horrifying. They were treating me exactly like a foolish, decaying old burden who could not possibly understand the complex, sophisticated adult world. Natalie, who had been aggressively texting on her phone just moments before, set her device face down on the table, and joined the coordinated assault. "Honestly, Dad, you need to stop watching so many depressing news channels," she said, rolling her eyes with a dramatic sigh of supreme irritation. "You are letting your age make you completely paranoid. You isolate yourself in this massive house all day, and your mind just naturally starts inventing ridiculous problems that do not actually exist." Her husband, Derek, nodded in solemn agreement, slicing into his prime rib with a smug, self-satisfied expression. "Natalie is right, Harrison," he added, pointing his silver fork directly at me. "You are stressing yourself out over absolutely nothing. Bradley is an expert in these matters. You need to just sit back, relax, and let the younger generation handle the heavy lifting. You should be focusing all your energy on getting excited about the big holiday trip. We have already booked the luxury ski lifts and the private dining experiences for Sun Valley. Just get ready to relax by the massive stone fireplace in Idaho and let us pamper you. We have handled absolutely everything." I looked around the lavishly decorated dining table, meeting the gaze of every single person in the room. They were all smiling at me now, a united front of condescending, predatory affection. They were actively gaslighting me, attempting to manipulate my perception of reality to serve their own twisted, greedy agenda. They genuinely believed that their coordinated, patronizing tone had successfully neutralized the threat. They thought the foolish, anxious old man had been successfully pacified. "You are right," I said, allowing a soft, relieved sigh to escape my lips. "I suppose I do worry too much about things I do not fully understand anymore. I am very lucky to have such a smart, capable son looking out for my best interests. Thank you for explaining it to me, Bradley. I will stop stressing about the legal paperwork and focus on packing for Idaho." Bradley exhaled a long, deeply hidden breath of profound relief. The rigid tension finally left his shoulders, and the color slowly began to return to his pale cheeks. "Of course, Dad," he said, his arrogant swagger fully returning. "That is what family is for. Now let us enjoy this incredible dinner Monica put together and talk about something a lot more fun than state taxes." The conversation around the table quickly shifted back to their expensive hobbies, their upcoming luxury purchases, and the elite friends they had invited to join us at the ski resort I was heavily paying for. They laughed loudly, drank generously, and celebrated their perceived victory with absolute arrogance. They truly thought they had brilliantly survived a dangerously close call. But as I sat there quietly sipping my water and playing the role of the docile, fading senior citizen, my engineer's brain was operating at absolute maximum capacity. In commercial construction, when you identify a critical failure in a load-bearing structure, you do not immediately tear it down while people are still standing inside the building. You smile, you nod, and you quietly secure the perimeter. Then you step back into the shadows and carefully draft the demolition blueprints. Their pathetic, transparent lies had given me the exact confirmation I needed. The text message on the tablet was not a joke, and it was not a misunderstanding. It was a legally binding death sentence masquerading as familial care. They had forged a vicious weapon designed to strip me of my wealth, my home, and my absolute freedom. They were fully prepared to discard me in a locked-down facility the moment the holidays were over, all while using my own money to fund their extravagant final celebration. I continued to smile at my daughter as she complained about the color of the interior leather she had chosen for her next vehicle. I nodded politely at my son-in-law as he bragged about his golf handicap. I played my designated part absolutely flawlessly. But beneath the surface, the loving father was entirely gone. I was already calculating the precise angles, the specific stress points, and the exact legal maneuvers required to bring their entire arrogant world crashing down around them. The trap was perfectly set, the foundation was rotting, and I was going to be the one to push the detonator. The rest of that holiday weekend proceeded with suffocating artificiality. I played the frail patriarch to perfection. I thanked Monica for the dry turkey and accepted Derek's stories about his amateur golf achievements. When Sunday evening arrived and they packed their luxury vehicles to return home, I stood on the front porch of my Mercer Island estate and waved them off with a warm smile. But the moment their taillights faded into the misty Seattle fog, the smile dropped from my face. I walked back inside the massive, painfully quiet house and locked the heavy wooden door. The initial shock of discovering their vile plot had worn off, leaving behind a cold, crystallized clarity. I spent the next 2 days meticulously reviewing every interaction, spoken word, and physical cue from the past 6 months. I was searching for the structural fractures I had blindly ignored. The sudden visits from Bradley, Monica's excessive interest in my medical routines, Natalie's push to ensure I updated my final will before the end of the fiscal year. They had been laying the groundwork for months, isolating me within my own life, while quietly positioning themselves to assume total control. I realized I was surrounded by enemies masquerading as my own flesh and blood. I needed concrete intelligence immediately. The crucial break in their carefully constructed facade arrived on a dreary, rain-soaked Monday morning, exactly 3 days after our tense Thanksgiving dinner. I was sitting at my solid oak desk in my private study, a room lined with decades of complex architectural blueprints and framed structural engineering degrees. The fire was crackling softly in the hearth, providing warmth against the bitter dampness of the Pacific Northwest winter. I had just opened my laptop to check the local morning news when a silent, automated notification popped up in the corner of my screen. It was a high-priority security alert from my primary wealth management institution, the bank that held the vast majority of my liquid assets and long-term investment portfolios. I clicked the notification, my eyes narrowing as I read the stark warning. The bank was formally notifying me of 3 consecutive failed login attempts on my primary retirement account. The system had automatically locked the account out of an abundance of caution and was requesting verbal authorization to reset the master password. But it was not the locked account that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was the specific security log attached to the bottom of the email. The bank's advanced security system had flagged the exact internet protocol address associated with the unauthorized login attempts. I am not a computer expert, but I know how to read raw data. I traced the numbers using a basic public directory search. The digital footprint did not trace back to a random overseas hacker. The access attempts had originated directly from a private network located in downtown Seattle. Specifically, the exact corporate building where my son Bradley worked as a senior financial executive. I leaned back heavily in my leather desk chair, staring intently at the glowing computer screen as the final horrifying puzzle pieces aggressively snapped into place. Bradley's desperate, sweating explanation at the Thanksgiving dinner table echoed violently through my mind. He had sworn to me, looking me directly in the eyes, that the massive stack of documents I had signed a month ago was simply standard Washington state estate tax paperwork. He claimed it was basic administrative boilerplate, designed exclusively to help insurance companies expedite claims for routine health checkups. But mathematical logic is an unforgiving master, and the equation my son presented to me was fundamentally broken. Basic estate tax forms do not grant someone the authority to change the master passwords on a private, highly secured investment portfolio. Routine medical proxies do not trigger aggressive, unauthorized login attempts on accounts holding millions of dollars in liquid capital. The lie was officially dead. My gut feeling, that primal instinct that had kept me alive on highly dangerous construction sites for almost half a century, was screaming at me with absolute certainty. They were not waiting for the holidays to conclude to initiate their takeover. They were actively moving against my assets right now, testing the perimeter defenses of my financial fortress, to see exactly what they could breach before the conservatorship papers officially went into effect in January. Bradley was quietly trying to assume total digital control of my wealth behind my back. I knew I had to move with immediate precision. My first instinct was to call the prestigious family law firm that had managed Caroline's estate after her passing. But I quickly remembered that it was Bradley who had personally introduced me to the lead partner of that specific firm. Bradley played golf with him. Bradley attended the same exclusive country club. If I called that office and started asking highly sensitive questions about the documents I had signed, the lawyer would undoubtedly pick up the phone and casually inform my son that his father was growing suspicious. I was entirely compromised within my own established network. I could not trust the family lawyer. I could not trust my financial planner. I could not trust my own children. I needed someone entirely outside of Bradley's arrogant sphere of influence. I needed a relentless, unsentimental predator who owed his loyalty solely to me and absolutely no one else. I closed my laptop and stood up from my desk with a renewed, fierce sense of purpose. The tired, aching joints in my knees and the mild stiffness in my lower back seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. I walked briskly into my master bedroom and opened my expansive cedar closet. I bypassed the casual sweaters my children expected me to wear and reached for a sharp, impeccably tailored dark gray suit that I had not worn since a major corporate board meeting over a decade ago. I selected a crisp white shirt, a conservative dark tie, and polished my leather dress shoes until they gleamed. When I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror, I did not see a frail, easily manipulated senior citizen preparing to be locked away in a discount nursing home. I saw Harrison Gallagher, the ruthless commercial structural engineer who had bent thousands of tons of heavy steel to his absolute will. I grabbed my thick leather briefcase, retrieved my heavy winter overcoat, and walked out to my detached garage. I bypassed the sensible sedan my children had heavily pressured me to buy and walked straight toward the meticulously restored vintage muscle car I kept safely under a heavy canvas tarp. The powerful engine roared to life with a deep, aggressive growl that vibrated through the concrete floor. I backed slowly out of the driveway, the cold Seattle rain immediately slicking the windshield, and merged smoothly onto the main highway, heading straight toward the towering glass and steel skyline of the downtown financial district. I was not going to play defense against my family anymore. I was going to find a shark, and I was going to show him exactly where the blood was in the water. The heavy rain of the Pacific Northwest pounded relentlessly against the windshield of my restored classic car as I navigated the winding wet roads leading away from my Mercer Island estate. I was originally heading straight downtown to the financial district to meet with the ruthless corporate litigator I had in mind. However, a sudden nagging thought diverted my intended path. There was a small misdelivered parcel sitting on my passenger seat. It had arrived at my house by mistake a few days prior, addressed to my son Bradley. Under normal circumstances, I would have simply waited for our next scheduled family gathering to hand it over. But the circumstances were no longer normal. They were aggressively hostile. I realized that dropping off the package unannounced right now would give me a rare, unfiltered glimpse into his daily life when he did not expect to be observed. I turned the heavy steering wheel, smoothly guiding the roaring engine toward the affluent, highly manicured suburban neighborhood where Bradley and Monica lived. Their home was a sprawling, ultra-modern architectural monstrosity of sharp angles, massive glass panels, and stark gray concrete. I had always hated the structural design of the place. It felt entirely cold and completely devoid of any genuine warmth, which perfectly reflected the people currently residing inside it. I parked my car silently on the street half a block away from their property, deliberately avoiding their wide, perfectly paved driveway. The rain had slowed to a light, freezing drizzle. I stepped out of the vehicle, pulling the collar of my dark wool overcoat up against the biting wind, and tucked the small cardboard package securely under my arm. As I walked down the quiet, tree-lined sidewalk toward their residence, my eyes automatically scanned the perimeter of their property. I noticed immediately that the massive 3-car garage door was wide open, exposing the brightly lit interior to the dreary gray afternoon. I approached with the quiet, measured steps of a man who had spent 45 years navigating treacherous, unfinished construction sites. I knew exactly how to move without making a single sound. As I drew closer to the edge of the open garage, the distinct sound of male voices drifted out into the cold air. It was Bradley and joining him was Derek, my arrogant son-in-law. I paused just behind the thick concrete pillar separating the driveway from the main entrance, keeping my body entirely hidden from their line of sight. I stood perfectly still, my breathing shallow and controlled, and simply listened. They were not talking about the upcoming holidays, and they were certainly not talking about the supposed estate taxes they claimed to be so incredibly worried about. They were laughing warmly, their voices echoing off the polished epoxy floor of the garage. I carefully leaned my head forward, just a fraction of an inch, allowing myself a clear view of the interior. Bradley and Derek were standing together over a large custom-built wooden workbench. Spread out across the entire surface of the table was a massive collection of glossy, high-end luxury brochures. "Look at the interior stitching on this specific model," Derek was saying, tapping his finger excitedly against one of the heavy, brightly colored catalogs. "It is completely hand-stitched Italian leather. Natalie wants the dark espresso color, but I think we should go with the pristine white. It just looks so much more exclusive. And with the third row seating, we will have plenty of room for our gear when we drive up to the ski resorts next season." Bradley nodded enthusiastically, picking up another glossy brochure and holding it up to the bright overhead lights. "Monica is demanding the panoramic sunroof and the upgraded entertainment package," he replied, chuckling softly. "The base model is already pushing $95,000. But honestly, what is another 20 grand at this point? The funds will be completely liquid by the second week of January anyway. We might as well order the absolute top-tier trims. We deserve to upgrade our lifestyle after dealing with all this endless family drama lately." I stood frozen behind the concrete pillar, feeling a sickening wave of pure, unadulterated revulsion wash over my entire body. They were not just browsing. They were actively customizing orders for multiple brand-new luxury sports utility vehicles. But the horrifying conversation did not stop at expensive cars. Derek reached into a sleek leather messenger bag resting on the floor and pulled out a thick folder filled with architectural floor plans. He unrolled the large papers directly over the car brochures. "The contractor said they can completely tear down the back patio and start pouring the foundation for the new heated infinity pool by February," Derek explained, tracing his finger along the blue lines of the blueprint. "The total estimate is clocking in around $250,000. Natalie is already picking out the imported Spanish tiles for the deck." Bradley whistled appreciatively, leaning over to inspect the expensive construction plans. "It is going to look absolutely incredible, man," Bradley said, patting Derek firmly on the shoulder. "Just tell the contractor to lock in the dates. Once the final conservatorship documents are officially filed and stamped by the judge, I will have total unrestricted access to the primary investment portfolios. We can authorize the wire transfers for the pool and the vehicles on the exact same day." Their sheer breathtaking arrogance was almost impossible to fully comprehend. They were openly, casually spending money that they did not actually have. Money that I sacrificed my entire adult life to earn. They treated my savings like lottery winnings already deposited into their accounts. They were picking out Italian leather seats and imported Spanish pool tiles, while actively finalizing the legal paperwork to lock me away in a discount heavily secured nursing home facility. I had spent decades climbing freezing steel beams hundreds of feet in the air, risking my life every single day to make sure my children never knew the bitter sting of poverty. I had paid for their prestigious educations and completely funded their lavish weddings. In return, they were eagerly planning how to divide my corpse before I had even taken my final breath. The profound sickness deep in my stomach quickly hardened into something completely unbreakable. It was pure, highly concentrated resolve. Any lingering doubts about my upcoming actions were incinerated. They were not misguided children who had made a poor judgment call. They were calculating predators who felt zero remorse for the violence they were preparing to inflict upon me. I stepped back into the cold, steady rain without making a single sound. I absolutely did not announce my presence. I did not walk into the garage and demand an explanation for the glossy brochures and the expensive pool blueprints. Confronting them right now would only cause them to panic and aggressively accelerate their timeline. I need them to remain perfectly comfortable in their arrogant delusions. I needed them to firmly believe that their master plan was progressing exactly as they had designed it, up until the moment I decided to destroy it all. The heavy rain continued to fall as I drove away from my son's affluent suburban neighborhood. The cold dread, wrapping around my chest all morning, evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp focus. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to hold his fractured family together. I was a man returning to the environment that had forged him. The towering skyscrapers of glass and steel looming ahead through the gray fog were my true territory. For 45 years, I had designed unbreakable skeletal frameworks for those exact structures. I knew precisely how they were built, and I knew exactly what it took to bring them crashing safely to the ground. I navigated the busy downtown streets and pulled into the dark underground parking garage of a sleek corporate high-rise. I slid my vehicle into a reserved executive spot, killed the engine, and stepped out into the damp concrete cavern. I rode the polished elevator up to the 42nd floor in absolute silence. The heavy metal doors parted smoothly, revealing the deeply intimidating reception area of Hughes and Associates. This was not a friendly suburban family law firm. This was a massive, highly aggressive firm, built entirely for brutal corporate warfare. They dealt exclusively in hostile business takeovers, commercial liability suits, and aggressive financial litigation. The receptionist, a sharply dressed young woman, looked up from her dual computer monitors as I approached the mahogany desk. She asked if I had an appointment. I placed my hand flat on the polished wood and told her to inform Victor Hughes that Harrison Gallagher was standing in his lobby. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before picking up her phone. Less than a minute later, the frosted glass doors leading to the inner executive offices swung wide open. Victor Hughes walked out with rapid, purposeful strides that commanded immediate attention. I was an imposing man in his late 50s, wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that radiated absolute authority. He possessed sharp, predatory facial features and pale, icy blue eyes that never seemed to blink. In the highly competitive Seattle commercial real estate world, Victor was widely known and deeply feared as an absolute shark. I was ruthless and aggressively brilliant in a packed courtroom. More importantly, he owed me a massive unpayable debt. 15 years ago, Victor was representing a commercial developer facing a catastrophic lawsuit over a collapsed parking structure. The entire city blamed his wealthy client, citing cheap building materials and severe negligent oversight. I was brought in as an independent structural engineering consultant to review the damage. I spent 3 grueling weeks analyzing the twisted steel and shattered concrete until I proved definitively that the critical failure was due to an unforeseen seismic fault line, not builder negligence. My expert testimony saved his client from total financial ruin and cemented Victor's reputation as an undefeated powerhouse litigator. He had looked me directly in the eye after that verdict and told me that if I ever needed a massive favor, I only had to ask. I was standing in his lobby to finally collect on that sacred promise. Harrison Victor said loudly, extending a firm, incredibly heavy hand toward me. "It is incredibly good to see you again. Come into my office right now." I followed him down the silent hallway, passing rows of anxious junior associates, working feverishly behind thick glass walls. We entered his corner office, a deeply imposing space with breathtaking panoramic views of the stormy Puget Sound. Victor directed me toward a pair of expensive leather chairs sitting opposite his massive oak desk, but I declined the generous offer to sit. I walked straight up to the edge of his desk, snapped open my thick leather briefcase, and pulled out the heavy stack of copied documents I had brought with me. I placed them firmly down on the center of his organized blotter. "I did not come here today to reminisce about the good old days, Victor," I said, keeping my voice completely level. "I need your sharpest eyes on these specific papers, and I need your absolute discretion." Victor immediately sensed the severe gravity of my tone. The welcoming smile vanished entirely from his face, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating mask of an apex predator analyzing a fresh drop of blood in the water. He sat down heavily in his leather desk chair, retrieved his reading glasses, and pulled the thick stack of documents toward him. "What exactly am I looking at, Harrison?" he asked quietly, his eyes already flying across the first page of dense, complicated legal text. "My son aggressively pressured me to sign these documents at my house a month ago," I explained smoothly, standing tall with my hands firmly clasped behind my back. "He told me they were updated trust tax documents strictly required by Washington state to shield my estate from new fiscal penalties. He confidently claimed it was just standard administrative paperwork. I trusted my boy, and I signed them without bringing them to you for a proper review. It was the most foolish mistake of my entire life." Victor did not respond immediately. The only sound in the corner office was the steady rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the crisp rustle of thick paper as he rapidly flipped through the dense pages. As he read deeper into the complicated stack, I watched his posture change entirely. His shoulders stiffened aggressively, his jaw clenched tight, and a dark, dangerous shadow crossed his pale blue eyes. He flipped to the very last page, stared intently at my signature, and then slowly removed his glasses, tossing them onto the desk with a heavy, frustrated sigh. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping an entire octave, barely hovering above a harsh whisper. "These are absolutely not tax documents, not even close. You have signed a sweeping, universally binding, durable power of attorney. You have also signed an advanced medical proxy that gives your son total, unchecked authority felt over your healthcare decisions." I looked directly into Victor's icy eyes, fiercely refusing to show even a single ounce of fear. "I know," I replied, my voice as hard as structural steel. "They think I am a confused, decaying old man who will quietly surrender my freedom without a fight. I need you to initiate a completely quiet, highly classified forensic audit of my entire estate," I commanded. "I need to know exactly what they have touched and what accounts they have attempted to access. I need you to dig into the deepest shadows of my financial portfolio without alerting Bradley's legal team. Do not make a single ripple that they could possibly detect. Can you do that?" "Victor." Victor stood up slowly from his desk, extending his hand across the documents to seal the pact. "I am not a family lawyer, Harrison," he said, his grip firm and unyielding. "I will assign my best forensic accountants to your portfolio immediately. We will track every single penny, every digital signature, and every authorized transfer linked to your name. You have my absolute word." The trap was now actively being built, and my family had absolutely no idea. I spent the next 48 hours waiting in agonizing silence. I stayed inside my massive empty house, going through the mundane motions of my daily routine, while my mind constantly calculated the devastating variables of my upcoming war. I drank my morning coffee, I read the daily newspaper, and I watched the rain batter the glass windows of my study. I did not call my son. I did not text my daughter. I simply existed in the quiet, tense atmosphere of a building, waiting for the demolition charges to finally detonate. I paced the hardwood floors of my living room, staring at the framed photographs of my late wife, wondering how the children she had loved so fiercely could have evolved into such unfeeling, greedy predators. On the afternoon of the third day, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a secure, unlisted number. When I answered, Victor Hughes did not bother with pleasantries or formal greetings. He simply told me to come down to his corporate office immediately. His voice was completely devoid of its usual aggressive energy, replaced instead by a cold, deadly serious tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at absolute attention. I grabbed my thick winter coat, walked out to my vintage muscle car, and drove straight back into the heart of the downtown financial district. The drive felt entirely different this time. I was no longer a man seeking simple confirmation of my worst fears. I was a man driving directly toward the epicenter of a massive life-altering catastrophe. When I stepped out of the private elevator and walked into the reception area of Hughes and Associates, the receptionist did not ask me to wait. She immediately stood up from her desk and escorted me straight down the long, silent hallway to Victor's corner office. Victor was not sitting behind his massive oak desk when I walked into the room. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the gray, churning waters of the Puget Sound, with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The heavy stack of documents I had given him was spread out across the polished surface of a large conference table sitting in the center of the room. He turned around slowly as the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me. "Harrison," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat at the long table. "Please sit down. I need you to brace yourself. I have seen incredibly ugly things in my 30 years of corporate litigation, but what your family has orchestrated here is uniquely sickening." I did not sit down. I walked over to the table and looked down at the highlighted pages, the red ink circling specific paragraphs, and the aggressive legal notes Victor's team had furiously scribbled in the margins. "I told you I am not a fragile old man, Victor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I spent my life building structures that do not break. Tell me exactly what they have done. Give me the raw, unfiltered data." Victor nodded slowly, respecting my demand for the blunt truth. He walked over to the table and placed his finger on the primary document I had blindly signed in my study just a month prior. "Bradley lied to you with absolute premeditated precision," Victor explained, his voice dropping into a harsh clinical cadence. "There is absolutely nothing in these pages regarding Washington state estate taxes or routine insurance claims. What you signed is a universally binding, completely comprehensive, durable power of attorney. This specific document does not just give your son the ability to help manage your wealth. It legally surrenders your entire autonomous existence to him. It grants Bradley absolute unchecked authority to liquidate your investment portfolios, sell your Mercer Island estate, empty your bank accounts, and redirect every single penny of your lifetime savings into offshore accounts under his direct control. It effectively reduces you to a legal ghost, completely incapable of making a single financial decision for the rest of your natural life." I stared at my own signature on the bottom of the page, feeling a sickening wave of pure betrayal wash over my entire body. I had freely handed my son the keys to my absolute destruction because I had foolishly believed he loved me. But Victor was not finished. "The financial theft is actually the least horrifying part of this entire operation," he continued, pulling a separate, thinner folder from the bottom of the stack. "This second document is what truly secures their plan." We dug into the medical proxy clauses hidden at the very back of the original stack. We tracked the specific medical provider listed in the fine print. It traces back to a private, highly exclusive concierge physician who happens to share a very lucrative country club membership with your son-in-law, Derek. I frowned, struggling to understand the connection. "Why would Derek involve a private doctor in a financial trap?" I asked. Victor opened the thin folder and slid a certified medical dossier across the table toward me. "Because they needed to completely neutralize your ability to fight back," Victor stated grimly. "This is a fabricated medical evaluation officially stamped and signed by Derek's private doctor. It diagnoses you with severe, rapidly advancing, late-stage dementia. According to this falsified medical record, you are currently experiencing aggressive cognitive decline, severe memory loss, and frequent episodes of dangerous confusion. It legally establishes you as entirely incompetent, unable to manage your own basic daily affairs, and a profound danger to yourself." The air rushed out of my lungs. I looked down at the official medical seal, staring at the clinical lies printed on the crisp white paper. They did not just want to steal my money. They wanted to entirely erase my humanity while I was still breathing. With this fake diagnosis combined with the durable power of attorney, Bradley had the absolute legal right to force me into a locked-down memory care facility against my will. That was what the Shady Pines text message meant. They were going to throw me into a cheap, heavily restricted asylum, and if I tried to tell anyone I was perfectly sane, the nurses would simply look at this fraudulent medical file and dismiss my desperate pleas as the tragic ramblings of a severely diseased mind. I would die trapped in a sterile room shouting at padded walls, while my children sat in a luxury ski resort spending my fortune. It was a flawless, virtually undetectable execution of ultimate betrayal. The absolute chilling cruelty of their plan hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. They were entirely willing to bury their own father alive just to expedite their inheritance and secure their wealthy social status without any future inconvenience. I slowly looked up from the fraudulent medical dossier and met Victor's icy blue gaze. The grief and the shock completely vanished from my system. The agonizing, heartbreaking sadness was entirely gone, replaced by something much darker. All that remained was cold, calculated mechanical fury. "How do we destroy them?" I asked softly. Victor quietly leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together as a predatory smile slowly spread across his sharp face. "We do not destroy them with a loud, messy public confrontation. Harrison," he replied, his voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet office. "Confrontation gives them a chance to panic, to call their corrupt doctor, and to forcefully activate the conservatorship before we are fully prepared. If we attack them directly right now, they will simply use that fraudulent medical dossier to paint you as a paranoid, deeply confused old man suffering from aggressive delusions. Instead, we are going to completely neutralize their entire arsenal while they are looking the other way. We are going to make the weapon they built completely useless." Victor leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished mahogany table, and began to outline a legal maneuver so brilliantly devastating that I could not help but admire his ruthless intellect. He explained that fighting a durable power of attorney in open court could take months of agonizing legal battles. During that time, my son could still attempt to freeze my assets or force me into a medical facility. The most efficient way to defeat a man trying to steal your property is to ensure that you legally have no property left to steal. He proposed the immediate creation of an ironclad, highly restricted, irrevocable trust. Unlike a standard living trust, an irrevocable trust could not be altered, modified, or canceled without the explicit permission of the designated trustee, which would be an independent, highly vetted corporate fiduciary of my choosing. Once my assets were transferred into this specific legal entity, they would cease to belong to Harrison Gallagher, the individual. Therefore, the power of attorney my son held over me would instantly become a completely worthless piece of paper. You cannot authorize the sale of a house or the liquidation of an investment portfolio if the person you have power over no longer legally owns those assets. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer brilliance of the strategy. It was a flawless countermeasure. I instructed Victor to draft the necessary paperwork immediately. I did not care about the exorbitant legal fees or the massive amount of administrative labor required to execute the maneuver. I simply wanted it done with absolute unyielding precision. For the next 5 days, I basically lived inside the secure conference room of Hughes and Associates. I drank countless cups of black coffee and meticulously signed my name hundreds of times across thick stacks of crisp, watermarked legal paper. We moved with aggressive speed and total secrecy. First, we tackled the Mercer Island estate. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar home where I had raised my ungrateful children was formally deeded over to the newly established trust. Next came the liquid assets. Decades of hard-earned savings, aggressive stock portfolios, massive mutual funds, and private high-yield savings accounts were systematically drained from my personal name and redirected into the heavily fortified corporate accounts managed by the independent fiduciary. We even transferred the ownership of my vintage muscle car. I watched as the vast, undeniable wealth I had accumulated over 45 years of backbreaking physical labor was quietly erased from my personal ledger. It was an incredibly surreal experience. Society tells you that your worth is measured by the assets tied directly to your name. Yet, as I signed away the very last mutual fund, leaving my personal checking account with just enough money to cover basic monthly groceries, I did not feel poor. I felt profoundly liberated. I was slipping out of the heavy, suffocating chains my family had so carefully forged for me. Every single signature was a silent, devastating strike against their greedy ambitions. They were currently sitting in their modern suburban homes, picking out imported pool tiles and customizing luxury vehicles, completely unaware that the vault they planned to rob had already been emptied. As a commercial structural engineer, I had spent my entire adult life studying the complex science of load distribution. When you construct a massive skyscraper, the entire building relies on the primary support pillars to carry the immense weight of the steel, the glass, and the concrete. If you need to replace a failing pillar without bringing the entire structure crashing down, you cannot simply smash it with a hammer. You have to install temporary hydraulic jacks, carefully lift the massive weight off the damaged pillar, and quietly shift the entire load to a new, secure foundation. Only then can you safely remove the old support. That was exactly what Victor and I were doing in that quiet, high-rise legal office. Bradley genuinely believed he held the master keys to my entire financial empire. He thought he possessed the absolute power to control my destiny. But while he was busy admiring his stolen keys, Victor and I had completely changed the locks, moved the vault to a different city, and burned the map. We were shifting the load, bearing weight of my entire existence, away from the fragile foundation of my family, and placing it onto the unbreakable bedrock of federal trust law. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. By the end of the week, the massive transfer was officially complete. The notary stamped the final documents with a loud, satisfying thud that echoed brightly through the silent conference room. Victor gathered the thick stack of completed paperwork, slid them into a secure leather binder, and locked them safely inside his massive steel filing cabinet. "It is done, Harrison," he said, letting out a long, heavy breath of satisfaction. "You are officially a ghost in the financial system. If your son marches into your bank tomorrow with that power of attorney and demands access to your funds, the teller will look at the screen and inform him that you have a net worth of roughly $2,000. I stood up from the large conference table and firmly shook my lawyer's hand. I felt a tremendous, empowering weight lift off my tired shoulders. I walked out of that corporate building and drove back to my quiet home on Mercer Island. The heavy, relentless Seattle rain had finally stopped, completely leaving the evening air feeling crisp and incredibly clean. When I finally walked through my front door, the massive, silent house felt entirely different. It was absolutely no longer a gilded cage waiting to be locked by my treacherous children. It was a carefully constructed stage for the final act of my play. That evening, my daughter Natalie called me to cheerfully remind me about packing my warmest winter clothes for the upcoming luxury trip to Sun Valley. I listened to her fake, sugary voice echoing through the phone, perfectly aware that she was speaking to a man who technically owned absolutely nothing. I promised her I would be fully ready for the holiday. I smiled as I hung up the phone, feeling a cold, mechanical satisfaction settling deep in my bones. Bradley held a weapon designed to destroy my life, but I had successfully removed all the ammunition. The final countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun today. I spent the following Tuesday morning quietly tending to the rose bushes in my backyard, a very simple task that allowed my mind to process the immense structural changes Victor and I had just executed. My phone rang just before noon. The caller identification displayed Hughes and Associates. Victor's voice came through the speaker, carrying an edge of sharp, predatory excitement. "Harrison," he said, keeping his tone low and urgent, "I need you to come back down to the office right now. My lead forensic accountant just flagged a massive anomaly in your personal credit history." I grabbed my keys and drove back into the city. When I arrived, Victor escorted me down a narrow corridor to a secure conference room. Sitting at a large table covered in thick financial printouts was Marcus, the head forensic auditor, meticulously combing through my financial history. Mr. Gallagher. Marcus began, his voice entirely clinical. When we initiated the comprehensive sweep of your assets, we also ran a deep diagnostic check on your primary Social Security number. What we found was a highly coordinated, incredibly aggressive sequence of hard credit inquiries originating over the past 2 weeks. I sat down, slowly opening the file folder. The figures staring back at me were absolutely staggering. According to the official credit report, 3 separate auto loans had been successfully originated and fully funded in my name just 4 days ago. The total combined principal for the new debt was over $350,000. They had financed 3 brand new, fully loaded luxury sports utility vehicles from a high-end automotive importer located just outside of Bellevue. I immediately thought back to the rainy afternoon I had stood silently outside my son's open garage. They had not just been browsing glossy brochures. They had been actively finalizing their customized orders. "I do not understand," I said, looking up at Victor. "I certainly did not authorize any loans for my children. How could a bank possibly approve over $250,000 in auto financing without my physical presence?" Victor leaned against the wall. "That is the most fascinating part of this entire discovery," he replied smoothly. "Bradley's financial history is heavily leveraged with his current mortgage, and Derek's debt-to-income ratio is maxed out. They completely bypassed their own financial limitations and used your pristine, untouched credit score to secure the entire fleet." Marcus pulled another document from the bottom of the stack and handed it to me. "This is a digital copy of the final funding contract obtained directly from the dealership underwriting department," the accountant explained. "Take a very close look at the primary signature line on the last page." I flipped to the back of the contract. There, written in bold black ink, was my full legal name. The handwriting was an incredibly close match to my own, mimicking the sharp angles and specific cursive loops I had used my entire life. But it was not my signature. It was a highly practiced, deliberate forgery. I felt a cold, mechanical anger settle deep into my bones, erasing the last lingering traces of fatherly affection. My own son, the boy I had raised and protected, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with his college applications, had deliberately forged my signature to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars in credit. "They genuinely believed they were completely untouchable," Victor stated, pointing at the forged signature. "They thought that because they possessed that durable power of attorney and that fraudulent medical diagnosis of advanced dementia, they basically owned you. They assumed no bank or police department would ever believe the frantic accusations of a mentally decaying old man. But their sheer arrogance made them incredibly sloppy. The conservatorship papers they planned to file do not legally take effect until the first week of January. By securing these luxury vehicles right now before the legal trap was fully sprung, they have committed severe, highly documented federal wire fraud." I stared at the forged documents, my mind calculating the devastating weight of this new information. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to completely destroy them. This was an offensive strike against calculating criminals who had actively stolen my identity. I looked at Victor, my expression completely devoid of any paternal hesitation. "I want to report this massive fraud immediately," I commanded. "But I do not want the police knocking on Bradley's door today. If we arrest them right now, they will simply hire expensive defense attorneys and drag this out in the courts for years. I want to hit them when they are absolutely most vulnerable. I want to isolate them completely. I want them to feel the exact same sheer, terrifying helplessness they fully intended to force upon me in that locked-down nursing home facility. I want their downfall to be absolute, incredibly public, and entirely inescapable." I instructed Victor and Marcus to contact the Federal Fraud Department and the specific banks holding the auto loans. I wanted to file a formal, heavily documented report regarding the forged signatures and the stolen identity. However, I requested a highly specific, aggressively timed legal action known as a silent freeze. I wanted the banks to process the fraud investigation quietly behind the scenes. I wanted them to lock down the loans flag the luxury vehicles as stolen property and freeze every single credit line attached to my name. But the most important part of my plan was the exact timing of the execution. I ordered the bank to delay the final absolute lockdown of all accounts until December 24th at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. Victor raised an eyebrow, his sharp mind quickly grasping the sheer brutality of my timing. Christmas Eve, he noted quietly. They are leaving for Sun Valley tomorrow morning. They will be driving those 3 stolen luxury vehicles all the way up into the freezing mountains of Idaho. If the massive credit freeze hits their accounts at exactly 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve, they will be standing in the lobby of an ultra-luxury resort with absolutely no way to pay for their reservations. I nodded slowly, feeling a cold, righteous satisfaction blooming in my chest. Yes, I replied. They plan to spend $150,000 of my money entertaining their pretentious friends. When those credit cards are violently declined at the front desk, they will face absolute public humiliation. And when they walk outside to figure out a backup plan, the local sheriff will be waiting in the snowy parking lot to impound their stolen vehicles. The trap was now fully armed, and the timer was relentlessly ticking down toward their absolute destruction. There would be absolutely no mercy, no second chances, and no more free vacations. My children were about to learn that actions carry severe consequences, and the bill for their betrayal was finally coming due. I calmly placed the documents back into the heavy file folder and handed them across the polished table to Marcus. The architect of their impending ruin had officially finalized the blueprints, and the demolition crew was fully prepared to break ground on Christmas Eve. I parked my vintage muscle car directly in front of the massive stone building that housed the regional headquarters of my primary financial institution. For over 40 years, I had banked with the exact same establishment. I had built a sterling reputation, maintaining an immaculate credit score, and amassing a substantial net worth through decades of grueling commercial construction projects. I did not walk up to a standard teller window when I entered the grand, echoing lobby. I bypassed the long waiting lines entirely and walked directly toward the heavy mahogany doors of the executive management wing. The senior branch manager, a meticulous man named Richard, who had personally overseen my vast investment portfolios for the last 15 years, greeted me with immediate and profound respect. He ushered me into his private corner office, offering me a comfortable leather chair and a cup of hot coffee. I politely declined the beverage. I snapped open my heavy leather briefcase, pulled out the certified documents Marcus had just prepared, and placed them firmly on the center of Richard's pristine desk. "I need you to look very closely at these 3 auto loan contracts," I instructed, keeping my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Richard adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, scanning the heavily highlighted financial figures and the forged signatures at the bottom of the pages. Within seconds, the polite professional smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, genuine alarm. He immediately recognized that the signatures were highly practiced forgeries. He knew my conservative financial habits perfectly well. He knew I would never abruptly finance 3 separate luxury vehicles from a high-end dealership without consulting his office first. I explained the entire horrific situation to him in a calm, highly clinical manner. I laid out the fraudulent medical diagnosis. My son-in-law had aggressively procured the secretly drafted power of attorney and the imminent terrifying plan to lock me away in a discount nursing home. Richard was absolutely horrified. He immediately reached for his desk phone, declaring that he needed to contact the local police and the federal fraud department, right that very second, to have my children arrested for elder abuse. I reached out and gently placed my hand over his, physically stopping him from lifting the receiver. "I do not want them arrested today, Richard," I said, staring directly into his worried eyes. "If we send the authorities to their door right now, they will simply hire expensive defense attorneys, post bail, and drag this entire ordeal through the corrupt court system for years. I do not want a messy, prolonged legal battle that drains my resources. I want an absolute, inescapable demolition. I want you to initiate a highly specific protocol today. I need a silent freeze placed on every single account, credit line, and asset linked to my social security number. Richard paused, his hand slowly falling away from the telephone receiver. A silent freeze was a severe, highly restricted security measure typically reserved for massive corporate espionage or severe federal identity theft cases. It meant that the accounts would appear completely normal and fully functional on the surface. But the moment a transaction was attempted, the entire system would aggressively decline the charge and immediately flag the user for severe fraudulent activity. You want to let them keep thinking they have total access, Richard stated quietly, slowly grasping the sheer magnitude of my sophisticated strategy. I nodded firmly. Exactly, I replied. I want the Federal Fraud Department notified today. I want the lenders who issued those auto loans fully briefed on the forged signatures. But I need all of them to agree to hold their absolute fire until a very specific moment in time. I leaned back in the comfortable leather chair and clearly outlined my exact timeline. I instructed Richard to aggressively schedule the absolute total lockdown of my entire financial network to execute automatically on December 24th at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. Richard stared at me in stunned silence for a long moment, before a slow, understanding nod finally shifted his rigid posture. He knew precisely what I was doing. My children and their pretentious, wealthy friends were scheduled to arrive at the ultra-luxury ski resort in Sun Valley, Idaho, on the afternoon of Christmas Eve. They were actively planning to use my credit to cover the massive $85,000 upfront hold for the luxury penthouses and the private catering. By scheduling the silent freeze for exactly 5 o'clock, I was ensuring that they would be standing right in the middle of a crowded, elegant resort lobby when the financial guillotine finally dropped. It took over 3 hours of intense, high-level phone calls to finalize the complex arrangements. Richard personally contacted the regional director of the Federal Fraud Division, explaining the sensitive, highly volatile nature of the abuse and identity theft involved. He then conferenced in the underwriting departments of the automotive lenders who had unknowingly approved the fraudulent vehicle loans. Because of my substantial net worth and the irrefutable evidence provided by Victor's forensic team, the institutions agreed to coordinate the massive strike. The 3 brand-new luxury sports utility vehicles were officially flagged in the national database as stolen property obtained through severe wire fraud. The local sheriff in Blaine County, Idaho, where the resort was located, was quietly notified of the impending arrival of the stolen vehicles. Every single gear, spring, and lever of my trap was now locked into its proper place. I walked out of the bank just as the sun began to dip below the towering Seattle skyline. I felt an incredible, profound sense of peace wash over my tired bones. In commercial structural engineering, the most critical phase of a controlled demolition is the quiet period right before the explosive charges are detonated. The building stands tall and proud, looking completely normal to the untrained eye. The people walking past it have absolutely no idea that the internal support pillars have been strategically severed. They do not know that the entire massive structure is currently being held together by nothing more than a fragile illusion of stability. That was exactly where my family was standing right now. I drove back to Mercer Island, pulling into my quiet, empty driveway. I walked through the dark, echoing rooms of my house, looking at the expensive furniture and the imported rugs that my children felt so incredibly entitled to inherit. For weeks they had treated me like a ghost, a lingering inconvenience that was already dead in their greedy minds. They had spent my money, forged my name, and actively plotted to strip away my basic human rights, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the man they were dealing with. I was not a fragile, helpless victim waiting to be discarded. I was the architect of their complete undoing. I walked into my study and poured myself a small glass of expensive bourbon. Tomorrow was December 23rd. The explosive charges were set. All I had to do now was sit back, relax, and patiently wait for exactly 5 o'clock to arrive and shatter their entire arrogant world. The morning of December 23rd arrived with a crisp, freezing chill that hung heavily over Mercer Island. I woke up at 5 o'clock completely rested and deeply focused. The massive house, which had been silent for weeks, suddenly erupted into a whirlwind of chaotic, entitled energy around 8 in the morning. Bradley, Monica, Natalie, and Derek had coordinated to use my sprawling estate as the primary launching pad for their grand holiday caravan. By 9 o'clock, their elite circle of pretentious friends and wealthy corporate partners began pulling into my long, circular driveway. They carried expensive designer luggage, custom-tailored ski equipment, and an atmosphere of loud, unearned superiority. I stood quietly by the large bay window in my private study, a steaming cup of black coffee in my hand, and simply watched the spectacle unfold. It was exactly like watching a flock of well-dressed vultures gathering for a massive feast. What truly commanded my attention, however, were the 3 vehicles parked aggressively at the very front of the driveway. They were breathtaking, brand-new luxury sports utility vehicles. One was a blinding white, and the other 2 were painted a deep metallic espresso black. These were the exact vehicles I had listened to them customize in the garage just weeks prior. I could clearly see the upgraded panoramic sunroofs reflecting the morning light and the hand-stitched leather interiors through the tinted glass. They gleamed with the arrogant polish of stolen wealth. My children were casually paying hundreds of thousands of dollars of severe bank fraud directly on my own front lawn, completely confident that their aging father would never notice the financial discrepancies. They were loudly bragging to their friends about the heavy horsepower, slapping the hoods of the cars with absolute pride. Every single boast was another nail in their impending legal coffins. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter warmth, and prepared to deliver my final, most crucial performance. I walked out of my study and slowly made my way toward the grand foyer, where the chaotic noise of laughter and clinking glasses echoed loudly off the marble floors. I grabbed a small leather overnight bag from the hall closet, carrying it toward the front door. Bradley was standing near the entrance, adjusting his expensive winter scarf and barking orders at the hired staff loading the vehicles. As I approached the final step of the grand staircase, I deliberately planted my foot, stiffened my entire body, and let out a sharp, agonizing gasp. I dropped the leather bag, allowing it to hit the marble floor with a heavy thud, and immediately gripped the sturdy wooden banister. I hunched over, clutching my lower back, clenching my eyes shut, and forcing a series of shallow, pained breaths. The festive chatter in the foyer instantly died down. Dad, Bradley said, his voice laced with a sudden sharp edge of profound irritation rather than genuine concern. "What are you doing? We are supposed to hit the highway in 15 minutes. I leaned heavily against the cold marble wall, playing the role of the frail, deteriorating senior citizen to absolute perfection. "It is my lower back, Bradley," I groaned, keeping my voice weak and trembling. "I must have twisted it terribly while I was packing my bags this morning. The pain is absolutely radiating down my legs. I cannot stand up straight." Monica rushed over her high heels, clicking rapidly against the floor. She placed a patronizing hand on my shoulder, but her eyes were darting frantically toward the front door, clearly terrified that my sudden medical issue would delay their luxurious departure. "Oh, Harrison, that is just terrible," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Do you need me to call a doctor for you? We can wait a little while if you just need to rest." I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes tightly closed and maintaining my hunched, defeated posture. "No, Monica," I whispered, forcing a heavy sigh. "I cannot possibly sit in the back of a vehicle for an 8-hour drive through the mountains in this kind of agonizing condition. I would be absolutely miserable, and I would only end up slowing the entire group down. You all need to go on ahead to Sun Valley without me." Natalie pushed her way through the crowd of silent friends. Her face was completely pale, clearly terrified that their massive free vacation was suddenly in jeopardy. "But Dad, you paid for the entire chalet," she insisted, her voice tight with thinly veiled panic. "You have to come. It is our family Christmas trip." I looked up at my daughter, making sure my eyes appeared tired, glassy, and completely resigned to my fragile old age. "Natalie, sweetheart, I am simply not physically capable of making this journey today, I said softly. I just want to lay down in my comfortable bed with a heating pad and get some much-needed rest. Please do not let my failing body ruin your festive holiday. I have already paid the massive deposit for the ski chalet. The private chefs are waiting for you. The imported champagne is already chilling in the refrigerators. I want you and Bradley to take your beautiful families, take your wonderful friends, and go enjoy the incredible vacation I provided for you. Just promise me you will have a wonderful time in Idaho. The profound relief that immediately washed over my children's faces was genuinely sickening to witness. They did not try to argue with me anymore. They did not offer to stay behind and take care of their injured father. The polite protests evaporated into thin air the very second they realized the $150,000 vacation was still fully funded and ready to be consumed. Bradley let out a deep, heavy breath, relaxing his shoulders. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Dad?" he asked, attempting to sound mildly reluctant, while his eyes practically gleamed with unrestrained joy. "I would hate to leave you here all alone on a holiday weekend. But if you really think the long drive is going to completely destroy your back, we have to respect your medical needs." "I am completely sure," I replied. "You go. Lead the caravan. Enjoy those beautiful new vehicles you bought." Bradley smiled broadly, completely missing the dark implication. He turned quickly, clapping his hands with aggressive energy. "All right, you heard the man," he announced. "Let us load up and get moving." The foyer erupted into cheers. They grabbed their bags and flooded out the front doors. I stood perfectly still, listening as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them. I heard the engines of the 3 stolen vehicles roar to life. I waited until the sound of their tires rolling down the asphalt faded away. Only when the house was enveloped in total silence did I finally move. I instantly straightened my back. The fake pain vanished entirely. I walked very calmly to the bay window and looked out at the empty driveway. They were gone. The trap was sprung. There was absolutely nothing else left to do but wait for tomorrow evening. The 24th of December arrived with a bitter, biting cold that swept across the Pacific Northwest. I spent the entire day in a state of absolute, tranquil anticipation. I did not decorate the massive house. I did not play any festive holiday music. I simply prepared a high-quality steak, poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, and sat in the heavy leather chair in my private study. My laptop was open on the desk in front of me, logged directly into the secure portal of my primary financial institution. I watched the digital clock in the corner of the screen with the patient, unwavering focus of a seasoned hunter waiting in a blind. My children had been driving for over 12 hours through the treacherous, snow-covered mountain passes. They were currently navigating the final stretch of highway leading directly into the heart of Sun Valley, Idaho. I could picture the scene with absolute clarity. The 3 stolen luxury vehicles gleaming aggressively against the pure white snow, leading a long caravan of wealthy, entitled friends toward the ultimate winter playground. They were completely exhausted from the long journey, but their spirits were undoubtedly soaring. They believed they had successfully left their bothersome, decaying father behind, leaving them entirely free to consume my wealth without guilt or consequence. They thought they had officially won. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, the digital interface on my computer screen blinked. A tiny silent notification appeared indicating that a transaction was actively being attempted on my primary credit line. They had finally arrived. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to vividly visualize the grand, bustling lobby of the ultra-luxury resort. The heavy wooden doors would be held open by smiling valets dressed in pristine winter uniforms. The massive stone fireplace in the center of the room would be roaring, casting a warm golden glow over the expensive leather furniture and the towering, beautifully decorated holiday trees. Bradley and Derek would hand the keys of the stolen vehicles to the parking attendants with their usual arrogant swagger. Monica and Natalie would be busy greeting their elite friends loudly complaining about the dreadful driving conditions while simultaneously bragging about the exclusive, multi-story penthouses they were about to occupy. They would walk confidently up to the polished mahogany front desk, feeling like absolute royalty. The concierge, a perfectly groomed professional trained to cater to the incredibly wealthy, would welcome them warmly. He would confirm the reservation for the multiple penthouse suites, the private dining arrangements, and the exclusive ski lift passes. Then he would politely request a credit card to cover the massive security hold. The total amount required up front for a party of that size staying for 2 full weeks during the absolute peak of the holiday season was $85,000. I watched the screen of my laptop as the $85,000 charge entered the banking system. I knew exactly what Bradley was doing in that very moment. He was casually reaching into his designer leather wallet, pulling out the platinum credit card tied directly to my primary accounts and sliding it across the polished counter with a smug, self-satisfied smile. He probably cracked a joke to the concierge about the outrageous cost of holiday luxury, fully expecting the transaction to process smoothly and instantly. He expected the concierge to hand him a stack of digital room keys with a respectful bow. Instead, the transaction status on my computer screen instantly shifted from pending to a bright flashing crimson red. Denied. The silent freeze protocol I had established with Richard the bank manager executed flawlessly. The Federal Fraud Department had permanently locked the account. I could almost see the polite, apologetic smile forming on the concierge's face as he looked at his computer monitor. He would discreetly inform Bradley that the card had been declined, likely suggesting that it was a simple security measure triggered by the large out-of-state travel expense. Bradley would have let out a dramatic, irritated sigh, rolling his eyes at the sheer inconvenience of the banking system. He would tell the concierge to try the card again, absolutely certain it was just a random electronic glitch. The concierge would swipe the platinum card a second time. On my screen, another bright red notification popped up. Denied. The smug confidence would slowly begin to drain from Bradley's face. He would pat his pockets, pulling out his own personal credit card, the one heavily tied to his over-leveraged mortgage and dwindling savings. He would hand it over, trying to maintain his arrogant composure in front of the growing crowd of wealthy friends gathering around the front desk. The concierge would process Bradley's personal card. A third red notification appeared on my screen. Denied. The lockdown had infected his accounts as well, since the fraud division linked his profile to the forged loans. The invisible net was pulling incredibly tight. The air in the luxury resort lobby would begin to shift. The warm, festive atmosphere would suddenly turn cold and painfully awkward. Monica would step forward, her face flushed rapidly, digging through her designer purse. She would hand the concierge her own credit card, speaking in a tight, breathless voice, assuring everyone that this was all just a ridiculous misunderstanding. The concierge would swipe Monica's card. Denied. Derek would forcefully push his way to the front of the counter, his face turning a dark, angry shade of red. He would aggressively hand over his premium corporate card, loudly demanding that the staff fix their broken payment machines immediately. He would try to intimidate the concierge, throwing his weight around as a wealthy executive. The concierge would remain perfectly calm and professional as he processed Derek's card. The fifth and final red notification illuminated my dark study. Denied. Absolute paralyzing panic would finally set in. The concierge, trained to handle embarrassing financial situations with utmost discretion, would politely but firmly ask my children to step aside from the main registration desk to allow the other paying guests to check in. They would be forced to move away from the counter, standing awkwardly in the center of the massive crowded lobby. Their elite circle of friends, the snobby partners and wealthy colleagues they had tried so desperately to impress, would begin to murmur among themselves. The hushed whispers of judgment and confusion would surround my family like a thick, suffocating fog. They had arrived expecting to be treated like royalty, but they were now standing in the middle of a 5-star resort with completely useless pieces of plastic entirely unable to pay for their own extravagant lifestyle. The humiliation was incredibly public, deeply profound, and absolutely inescapable. I slowly took a long, deeply satisfying sip of my expensive red wine. The demolition was proceeding exactly according to the blueprint. Every single structural pillar of their arrogant, greedy existence had been completely severed. They were entirely isolated, stranded in the freezing mountains, without a single penny to their names. And the absolute best part of this glorious devastation was that the true nightmare had only just begun to unfold for them. The heavy winter sky over Mercer Island had darkened by 5 o'clock. The freezing drizzle from earlier in the week had transitioned into a thick, quiet snowfall. I walked slowly from my study into the expansive kitchen, feeling a profound sense of tranquility that I had not experienced in years. I prepared a thick, perfectly marbled ribeye steak, searing it in a cast-iron skillet with fresh rosemary and garlic. The rich, savory aroma filled the empty house, replacing the suffocating tension that my children had brought with them just a day ago. I plated this meal, meticulously poured myself a second glass of the dry, full-bodied red wine, and carried my dinner into the living room. I sat down in my favorite leather armchair, resting the plate on a small wooden tray table. I ate my meal in absolute silence, watching the large white snowflakes drift lazily past the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. It was Christmas Eve. For the past decade, this exact evening was usually a chaotic, exhausting blur of hosting, arrogant guests paying exorbitant restaurant tabs, and listening to my children complain about the temperature of their imported champagne. Tonight, however, the only sound in my entire home was the gentle crackle of the fire burning steadily in the stone hearth. I chewed my steak, slowly savoring the rich flavor and the absolute unblemished peace of my surroundings. I knew exactly what was happening hundreds of miles away in the freezing mountains of Idaho. I could picture the scene with vivid clarity. The public humiliation, the frantic whispers, the desperate scrambling to find a piece of plastic that the banking system had not completely rejected. My children had built their social identities on the illusion of limitless wealth. Now they were standing in the lobby of an ultra-luxury resort, stripped of their financial armor, exposed as frauds to the very people they were trying so desperately to impress. Right on schedule. The heavy silence of my living room was shattered. My cell phone, resting quiet on the wooden side table next to my wine glass, began to vibrate intensely. The bright screen illuminated the dimly lit room, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a sharp knife. I slowly set my fork down on the porcelain plate, chewed my food deliberately, and swallowed before turning my head to look at the device. The caller identification displayed Bradley's name in bold letters. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I let it ring. I watched the device vibrate against the wood, listening to the persistent, urgent sound echoing off the high ceilings. For 42 years, I had always answered my son's calls on the very first ring. Whether he needed help with a broken bicycle, advice on a college application, or a massive check to cover his reckless spending, I had always been instantly available. I was the reliable, unending safety net that he had taken for granted his entire life. But that safety net had been completely removed. I let the phone ring 4 times, forcing him to wait, forcing him to feel a tiny fraction of the desperate anxiety he was currently experiencing in that resort lobby. On the 5th ring, just before the call diverted to voicemail, I calmly reached out and picked up the device. I pressed the green button, slowly brought the phone to my ear, and said hello in a perfectly mild, unbothered tone. Dad Bradley's voice exploded through the small speaker, completely lacking any standard greeting or polite preamble. He was breathing heavily, his words rushing out in a frantic, panicked jumble. His tone was not one of a concerned son calling to check on his injured elderly father. It was the aggressive, demanding tone of a severely inconvenienced corporate executive barking orders at a subordinate. "Where have you been?" he demanded sharply. "I have been trying to reach your bank for the last 20 minutes, but their automated system keeps directing me to an after-hours emergency line." You need to call Richard immediately and tell him to lift this ridiculous security hold. I took a very slow, measured sip of my red wine, letting the smooth liquid warm my throat before I responded. Security hold, I repeated, keeping my voice entirely innocent and slightly confused. What exactly are you talking about, Bradley? Is there some sort of problem with the reservations at the chalet? Bradley let out a harsh, exasperated sigh, clearly furious that he had to waste precious seconds explaining the situation to me. Yes, there is a massive problem, Dad. He snapped, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. We are standing in the middle of the main registration lobby right now. Half of Derek's partners are watching us. I handed the concierge your platinum card to cover the initial deposit for the penthouses and the private catering, and the ridiculous machine declined it. The system declined Monica and Derek's cards too. The bank flagged the out-of-state charges as suspicious activity because you are not physically here with us. It is a complete disaster. We look like absolute fools in front of everyone. You need to get on the phone with your wealth manager right this second and authorize the release of the funds. They are threatening to give our suites to another family if we do not clear the balance in the next 10 minutes. I sat perfectly still in my comfortable leather chair, listening to the sheer panic vibrating through my son's voice. He was terrified. He was entirely humiliated. But even in the middle of his desperation, he did not ask how my back was feeling. He did not ask if I was resting comfortably or if I had managed to eat a decent holiday meal by myself. His only concern was the sudden blockage of the financial pipeline he felt so entitled to drain. He viewed me purely as a utility, a convenient machine that existed solely to dispense luxury and comfort on command. He was demanding that I rescue him from a public embarrassment, unaware that he was blindly ordering his executioner to stop the blade from falling. I closed my eyes, picturing the arrogant faces of my children as they sat around my Thanksgiving table just weeks prior. I remembered the sickening way they had smiled at me while secretly plotting to lock me inside a cheap, heavily restricted nursing home facility for the rest of my natural life. They had intended to steal my identity, drain my estate, and erase my humanity without shedding a single tear. And now my son was aggressively commanding me to fund his extravagant lifestyle as if I owed him my very existence. The breathtaking audacity of his demand cemented the final stone in the wall of my resolve. I felt absolutely no pity for the man sweating in that resort lobby. I felt no sorrow for the daughter who had mocked my strict rules. The accommodating, loving father they had manipulated for 4 decades was permanently dead and buried. I was the architect of their ruin, and the time for playing the docile, confused victim was officially over. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear, allowing Bradley to continue his frantic rant. He barked orders, demanding I verify my identity, with the bank demanding a massive override for his pending transactions. His entitlement proved how effectively I had shielded him from the harsh realities of the real world. He had never been told no. I listened to the desperate tremor behind his arrogant demands, imagining him pacing the polished marble floors of the Sun Valley resort lobby, sweating profusely under the judgmental gazes of his wealthy peers. I raised the crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive red wine. The dark liquid felt warm and grounding against the cold, clinical precision of my current mindset. I swallowed, placed the glass gently onto the wooden tray table, and brought the phone close to my mouth. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. I did not shed a single tear of parental sorrow. When I finally spoke, my voice was as smooth, hard, and unforgiving as solid ice. "I cannot call the bank, Bradley," I said, keeping my tone conversational. Bradley stopped mid-sentence. The sudden interruption clearly caught him completely off guard. "What did you mean you cannot call the bank?" He snapped, his irritation instantly spiking back to the surface. "Dad, this is not the time to be difficult. We are literally standing in front of the concierge. Just pick up your phone and authorize the release. It will take you 2 minutes." I leaned back deep into the soft leather of my armchair, watching a large snowflake stick to the outside of the living room window before slowly melting away. I am afraid I am completely incapable of making that phone call, I replied, my voice echoing coldly through the empty house. My advanced dementia is acting up today. I am suffering from aggressive cognitive decline, severe memory loss, and dangerous confusion. I am legally incompetent, remember. The silence that instantly swallowed the phone line was absolute. It was the sudden, catastrophic sound of an entire universe coming to a violent, crashing halt. I could hear the faint ambient background noise of the busy ski resort. On his end of the connection, the soft murmur of wealthy guests and the clinking of champagne flutes. But from my son, there was absolutely nothing. No breathing, no protests, no demands. The crushing weight of my words had physically paralyzed him. I knew exactly what that specific medical terminology meant. I did not give him a single second to recover his breath. I pushed forward, driving the blade of reality as deeply into his chest as I possibly could. Let the old man complain through this last Sun Valley trip, I recited, keeping my pronunciation sharp and absolutely methodical. The conservatorship papers go into effect the first week of January. Monica already secured a bed at Shady Pines. It is cheap, locked down 24 hours a day, and he will not be able to bother anyone anymore. I paused, letting the exact verbatim transcription of his secret text message echo through the digital connection. Did I get the phrasing right, Bradley? I asked softly. Or did I miss a few cruel details from your little Operation Freedom group chat? A harsh, ragged sound finally escaped from the speaker of the phone. Dad, Bradley stammered, his voice completely devoid of its previous arrogant authority. It was a weak, trembling whisper of pure terror. Dad, wait. I can explain that. You do not understand. It was just a joke. It was out of context. There is absolutely no context that excuses preparing to bury your own father alive, I countered smoothly. You carelessly left the tablet unlocked on the kitchen island on Thanksgiving morning. I read every single word. I know all about the cheap nursing home. I know about your master plan to strip away my fundamental human rights the very second the holidays were over. And more importantly, I know exactly what was hidden inside those supposed trust tax documents you aggressively pressured me to sign in my study last month. No, please listen to me. Bradley pleaded, his breathing turning rapid and incredibly shallow. We were just trying to protect your assets. The doctors said you were getting older, and we just wanted to make sure everything was secure. Do not insult my intelligence by continuing to lie while your entire foundation is actively collapsing, I warned him. I hired a corporate litigator the very next day. My team conducted an invisible forensic audit of my estate while you were busy picking out tiles for your new pool. I have the fabricated medical dossier. I know you and Derek bribed a physician to falsely diagnose me with advanced dementia. I know you tricked me into signing a durable power of attorney. You intended to completely erase me. But Dad, the credit cards, Bradley whispered, his mind finally connecting the horrific dots of his current predicament. The bank hold. There is no security hold, Bradley, I stated with absolute crushing finality. There is no temporary electronic glitch. I ordered a silent freeze on every single account, credit line, and financial asset linked to my social security number. I specifically scheduled the total lockdown to execute today at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. I wanted you to drive all the way to Idaho. I wanted you to walk up to that front desk surrounded by the wealthy friends you try so desperately to impress. I wanted you to experience the exact same terrifying, helpless isolation that you eagerly planned to inflict upon me in that locked-down medical ward. The facade was completely shattered. The illusion of his wealthy, untouchable existence had been violently ripped away, leaving him entirely exposed to the brutal elements of his own devastating reality. I could hear Monica crying softly in the background, on his end of the line. She must have realized from his pale face that their entire criminal operation had been completely compromised. Derek and Natalie were likely standing right next to them, watching in sheer horror as their free, extravagant vacation literally disintegrated into thin air. "Dad, please, you cannot do this to us," Bradley begged. He was openly weeping now, the proud, arrogant executive reduced to a sobbing, desperate child. "We are stranded here. The resort will not let us check into our rooms. We do not have any money to pay for the drive back to Seattle. You have to lift the freeze. We are your family. You ceased being my family the moment you decided my freedom was an acceptable price to pay for your luxury," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. "I have spent the last month quietly transferring 100% of my wealth, my real estate, and my liquid assets into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. The power of attorney you hold is a completely worthless piece of paper, because I technically do not own anything in my own name anymore. The vault you planned to rob is totally empty, and the keys you hold unlock absolutely nothing." I took a slow sip of my wine, staring out at the falling snow. "The denied credit cards and the empty trust accounts are the least of your immediate concerns right now," I added, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper. "There is one final piece of business we need to address before I hang up this phone." My words hung in the digital space between Seattle and Sun Valley, heavy and absolute. For several long seconds, the only sound coming through the receiver was the jagged, panicked breathing of a 42-year-old man who suddenly realized he was standing at the edge of a massive, unyielding cliff. Bradley tried to speak, but his voice broke into a pathetic, high-pitched stammer. "Dad, please," he begged, the arrogant executive facade completely dissolving into the terrified tone of a cornered animal. "Please do not do this. We can fix this. I will tear up the power of attorney tonight. I will call the doctor and have the medical file completely erased. We will drive back to Seattle right now and beg for your forgiveness on our hands and knees. Just transfer the funds back to your personal accounts and lift the bank freeze so we can get out of this lobby. We are your children. You cannot just leave us here with absolutely nothing. We have no money to get home." I listened to his desperate bargaining with a profound sense of emotional detachment. I was not apologizing because he felt genuine remorse for trying to steal my life. I was only apologizing because my defensive engineering had successfully trapped him in a corner, and he was desperately trying to negotiate his way out of the crushing consequences. I took a deep, steadying breath, looking out through the frost-covered glass of my living room window. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing my Mercer Island property in a pristine, untouched layer of white. I thought about the 3 magnificent brand-new luxury sports utility vehicles they had so proudly paraded in my driveway just 12 hours ago. I thought about the glossy brochures I had watched them studying in the garage, customizing the imported leather seats and panoramic sunroofs with money I had sacrificed my entire life to earn. "I am afraid driving back to Seattle is not going to be an option for you tonight, Bradley," I stated, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any parental hesitation. "You see, when I sat down with my corporate litigator's forensic accounting team earlier this week, they uncovered a massive anomaly in my personal credit history. They found the funding contracts for 3 brand-new luxury vehicles from a high-end dealership in Bellevue. The total principal loan amount was over $350,000. The primary guarantor signature at the bottom of those documents was a highly deliberate forgery of my name." A sharp, terrifying gasp echoed through the phone line. It was not Bradley. It was Monica. She had clearly put the call on speakerphone, so the rest of the conspirators could hear the absolute destruction of their plans. Derek and Natalie were undoubtedly standing right next to her, sharing the exact same cold, paralyzing dread. "Dad, we just needed a co-signer to secure the promotional interest rates," Bradley babbled, his words stumbling over one another in a frantic rush to minimize the catastrophic crime he had committed. "We were going to make all the monthly payments ourselves. We never intended to leave you with the debt. It was just a temporary financial shortcut. We meant absolutely no harm. You forged my signature on federal lending documents to fund your extravagant lifestyle, while simultaneously planning to declare me legally incompetent." I corrected him, my tone sharpening into a lethal edge. Do you not see the massive, glaring structural flaw in your own deceptive architecture, son? You cannot have it both ways. You cannot bribe Derek's private doctor to fabricate a medical dossier claiming I am suffering from severe advanced dementia, and then turn around and use my name to secure massive financial loans. Since I am legally incompetent according to the medical paperwork you procured, I could not possibly have possessed the cognitive ability to sign those guarantor forms for the luxury vehicles you drove up there today. I let the devastating reality of his own actions wash over him. I heard the panicked whispers of my daughter and son-in-law in the background. They were finally realizing the sheer magnitude of the trap I had built. When I contacted the Federal Fraud Department and the automotive lenders to initiate the silent freeze on my accounts. I also provided them with your fraudulent medical paperwork, I continued calmly. The bank officially flagged the auto loans as severe identity theft and federal wire fraud. Because you transported the stolen property across state lines into Idaho, you have successfully elevated a state crime into a major federal offense. No, no, please, God, no! Natalie cried out in the background, her voice completely hysterical. Dad, please call them off. We will go to jail. Our careers will be ruined. We will lose everything. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my red wine, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the tears of thieves who had planned to bury me alive. Step away from the registration desk and look out through the large glass windows of the resort lobby. I instructed them, my voice echoing with the finality of a gavel. If you look very closely at the snowy parking lot, you will notice that the Blaine County Sheriff deputies are currently pulling into the resort. They are not there to help you with your declined credit cards. They are there to officially impound the 3 stolen vehicles you drove across state lines. And they are there to detain the individuals responsible for the federal identity theft. Distant wailing sirens suddenly bled through the phone speaker. The high-pitched urgent noise grew louder and louder, with every passing second piercing through the ambient chatter of the luxurious ski resort. The elite wealthy friends my children had brought along for their extravagant holiday were undoubtedly backing away from them in sheer horror. The social humiliation they feared more than anything else in the world was unfolding in real time, right in front of an audience they desperately wanted to impress. They were completely stranded in the freezing mountains, entirely penniless, publicly disgraced, and about to face the severe, uncompromising wrath of the federal justice system. Dad, I am begging you. Bradley sobbed, his voice completely breaking under the immense weight of his absolute ruin. Please help us. I spent 45 years building steel structures to protect you from the storms of life, I said, my voice dropping to an unbreakable whisper. But you tore down the foundation of our family for a quick payout. I am simply letting the building collapse exactly as you designed it. Goodbye, Bradley. I pulled the phone away from my ear, severed the digital connection, and placed the device face down on the wooden tray table. I leaned back in my leather armchair and looked out at the peaceful, snow-covered landscape. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The dark wine warmed my chest. For the first time in 4 years, I was alone for the holidays, yet I had never felt so incredibly free. The weeks following that unforgettable Christmas Eve passed with a quiet, steady rhythm that I had not experienced in decades. The harsh Pacific Northwest winter continued to blanket Seattle in thick layers of gray clouds and freezing rain. But inside my home on Mercer Island, the atmosphere was entirely clear and remarkably warm. I did not receive any more demanding phone calls. I did not have to endure any more passive-aggressive visits from people who secretly wished for my demise. The profound, deafening silence was the absolute greatest gift I could have ever asked for. Fast forward to late January. The swift and brutal machinery of the federal justice system had aggressively taken over the messy demolition of my children's lives. Through my attorney, Victor Hughes, I received regular, highly detailed updates regarding the catastrophic fallout of their luxurious winter getaway. The scene in the lobby of that ultra-exclusive ski resort in Sun Valley had apparently been even more spectacular than I had envisioned. When the Blaine County Sheriff deputies arrived with their flashing lights, cutting through the heavy snow, they did not quietly pull my son aside. They publicly detained Bradley, Monica, Natalie, and Derek Wright in the center of the grand foyer, placing them in handcuffs in front of their 20 wealthy friends and a lobby full of elite holiday guests. The 3 luxury sports utility vehicles were immediately impounded, towed aggressively out of the pristine resort parking lot as stolen property. Their absolute public humiliation was just the very beginning of their nightmare. Because they had crossed state lines in vehicles obtained through deliberate, heavily documented identity theft. The federal authorities took immediate jurisdiction over the case. They were currently drowning in a sea of massive, inescapable legal battles. They were facing multiple highly severe charges, including federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. The sheer gravity of the charges meant they were looking at significant mandatory prison sentences. Their carefully curated social standing evaporated overnight. The wealthy corporate partners they had invited to the ski resort completely cut all ties with them the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. Bradley was immediately suspended without pay from his senior executive position at the financial firm, pending the criminal investigation. Derek lost his lucrative corporate partnerships. The prestigious country club they belonged to quietly revoked their memberships, citing a strict morality clause. To fund their massive, desperately mounting legal defense fees, they were forced to rapidly liquidate everything they actually owned. They had to list their sprawling, ultra-modern homes for sale in a highly unfavorable winter market. The extravagant lifestyle they felt so incredibly entitled to live had been completely repossessed by the brutal reality of their own criminal arrogance. Meanwhile, I was busy constructing something entirely new. For the first time in years, my vast financial resources were not being senselessly drained by ungrateful parasites. I sat down with my financial advisor, Robert, and we looked over the pristine, fully secured accounts of my newly established, irrevocable trust. I had roughly $150,000 sitting perfectly liquid, the exact amount of money I normally would have wasted funding their annual toxic winter vacation. I decided that money needed to be heavily repurposed. On a crisp, clear Tuesday morning, I drove my vintage muscle car into the industrial district of South Seattle. I pulled into the parking lot of a highly respected local vocational trade school. This was the exact kind of institution where young, hungry students learned the brutal, honest work of commercial construction welding and structural steel fitting. I walked into the dean's office and completely changed the trajectory of 20 young lives. I used the vacation fund to officially establish the Caroline Gallagher Memorial Scholarship. I paid the full comprehensive tuition for 20 hardworking students who came from low-income families, young men and women who actually understood the profound value of a hard-earned dollar. I did not want any grand ceremonies or public recognition for the donation. The absolute pure satisfaction of knowing that my wealth was finally being used to build strong, capable foundations for deserving people was more than enough. When I returned to Mercer Island that afternoon, I walked through the grand foyer of my home and felt a deep, resonant peace settling into the very wood and stone of the structure. The house no longer felt like a massive, empty museum waiting to be plundered by greedy heirs. It felt like a fortress that had successfully repelled a massive siege. I walked into my study, sat in my leather chair, and looked at the framed photograph of my late wife resting on my solid oak desk. I knew Caroline would have been deeply heartbroken by the sheer wickedness our children had displayed, but I also knew she would have been fiercely proud of how I aggressively protected our life's work. I poured myself a simple cup of hot black coffee, no longer needing the strong wine to steady my nerves. I looked out the large glass window, watching a small pair of robins landing gently on the frost-covered branches of an old oak tree in the backyard. The dark, terrifying storm had officially passed. The corrupt, rotting pillars of my family had been entirely removed, and the remaining structure was finally standing strong, true, and perfectly level. I was 73 years old, officially entirely alone and completely unconditionally free. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp winter air fill my lungs, and allowed a genuine smile to finally cross my weathered face. The rest of my natural life was entirely mine to control, and I intended to enjoy every single second. I had survived their vicious, calculated betrayal by relying on the exact same logic and patience that had guided my entire career. I had refused to crumble under the crushing weight of their deception. I had methodically drafted my own brilliant blueprints for survival, quietly gathering indisputable evidence while they arrogantly celebrated their false victory. The satisfaction of watching their malicious plans completely backfire was incredibly profound. I finally felt a true, unbroken sense of peace washing over my mind. My legacy was now absolutely secure, shielded from their toxic grasp forever and always. People often mistake silence for ignorance and age for weakness. I spent 45 years building skyscrapers, ensuring every foundation was built to withstand the harshest storms. I applied that same engineering to my life. When my own flesh and blood tried to dismantle my dignity for a quick payout, I did not scream or beg. I simply let them build their house of cards, and then I quietly removed the bottom level. True family protects you when you are vulnerable. They do not plot your ruin. Respect is never inherited. It is earned. Betrayal always carries a devastating invoice. If you enjoyed this story of justice and stood cheering when the truth finally caught up to them, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Tell me in the comments down below, what would you have